Welcome to the deep dive.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Today we're going to tackle a concept that's so fundamental, it's almost invisible. Growth.
Right.
We see it everywhere from, a tiny sprout pushing through the soil to the mind-boggling advancements in technology.
Yeah.
And frankly, the ever-expanding scale of our societies.
Mm,
And it's easy to think that growth is just this, natural part of how things work.
yeah, it's just part of life.
And in many ways, it is.
Mm-hmm.
But the speed, the reach,
Yeah.
and frankly, the sheer intensity of growth in our modern world
Yeah,
are unlike anything that's been seen before in human history.
absolutely. I mean, if you think back, for most of human existence, life, for the vast majority of people, was characterized by a really slow, almost imperceptible pace of change.
Mm-hmm.
Like imagine generations of subsistence farmers, their lives tied to the land, with little surplus and limited interaction beyond their immediate local community. Like the kind of widespread and rapid growth we now just kind of take for granted is really a very recent blip on the historical timeline.
Yeah, it's a very, very recent phenomenon. And that's precisely why we're doing this deep dive today.
Yeah.
Our goal is to really explore these different ways that growth happens,
Yeah.
drawing from both the natural world, how life evolves and develops in our own, human history as well.
Absolutely.
And we want to not only appreciate the incredible achievements that modern growth has delivered, but also get, a realistic sense of its potential boundaries
Yeah.
in our contemporary civilization.
Mm-hmm.
And to really get a handle on this, we'll be looking at the numbers, the data that helps us kind of map out these growth journeys and understand these rates of growth.
Right.
And it's remarkable, how universal the concept of growth is.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
You can study it at the smallest scales, like how individual cells multiply,
Right. Like Darcy Wentworth Thompson talked about.
Exactly.
Fascinating stuff.
All the way up to the grandest scale of, how civilizations rise and sometimes fall.
Yeah.
And some even speculate about, a future point of just this runaway technological growth, the singularity, they call it.
The singularity.
While we can't possibly cover all of that today,
Right.
we will be focusing on, three main areas.
Okay.
We'll look at biological growth,
Hmm?
how living things from plants to animals develop.
Sure.
We'll explore technological growth, the advancements in our tools and machines and how we harness energy.
Yeah.
And finally, we'll examine kind of societal growth, changes in populations and economies and all those kinds of things.
Okay.
So why don't we kick things off by looking at the different shapes that growth can take?
Right.
It's not always just a straight line upwards, is it?
No, not at all.
Yeah.
So one of the most, I think, fundamental distinctions is between linear and exponential growth.
Okay.
And it's easy to, to picture. Imagine a stalagmite forming, in a cave,
Yeah.
drop by drop, mineral-rich water deposits, just this tiny bit of material.
Mm-hmm.
And over centuries, it grows, by this fairly constant amount each year.
Right.
That's linear growth,
Ah,
this steady additive increase over time.
yeah.
If you were to graph it, you'd just see a pretty straight line.
A straight line, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
But then you have, exponential growth, which is a whole different beast.
Okay.
Instead of this constant addition, the amount of the increase itself grows over time.
Okay.
So think of like a small snowball rolling down a hill.
Yeah.
It picks up more snow as it goes, getting
Yeah.
bigger, faster, and faster.
Yeah.
And if you plot that on a graph, like the stalagmite,
Yeah.
it would start off, looking fairly flat,
Yeah.
but then curve upwards, more and more steeply.
Right.
Now, what's interesting is that if you use a special kind of graph called a semi-logarithmic graph,
Okay.
imagine one of the axes being stretched out in this particular way. That exponential growth actually appears as a straight line.
Oh, interesting. So it's all in how you visualize it
Exactly.
that changes things.
Exactly. And this is where things can get a bit tricky,
Okay.
because exponential growth can look deceptively manageable
Right.
on a semi-log scale.
Right.
And sometimes it can lead to flawed predictions
Yeah.
or an underestimation of its true power.
You're right.
Remember that often cited example from, I think it was a City report a while
I
back,
can't remember that.
claiming just incredibly rapid adoption rates for things like, I think they used Angry Birds as an example,
Yeah.
reaching like 50 million users.
Right.
Like it completely overlooked the fundamental differences in how people adopt different kinds of technologies and the saturation points of those markets.
It's a really important point because just because something is taking off like a rocket doesn't mean it can automatically maintain that trajectory indefinitely.
Right, exactly.
Or that you can directly compare the growth of wildly different things. Right. But, here's where it gets really interesting to me.
Okay.
We're seeing another pattern of growth become increasingly relevant.
Yeah.
Especially as we've become more aware of, the finite resources of our planet, logistic or S-shaped growth.
Yeah, the S curve.
So tell me about that.
Yeah, so the logistic curve, it describes a growth process that starts slowly.
Okay.
Then it accelerates.
Yeah.
But it eventually kind of tapers off as it approaches some limit, what we call a carrying capacity or a saturation point.
Yeah.
So think of it like a sunflower growing.
Okay.
It starts as a tiny seed, grows relatively slowly at first.
Right.
Then it shoots up really rapidly in height.
Yeah.
And finally, its growth just slows down as it reaches maturity. And its resources are allocated to, reproduction rather than just growth.
Yeah, so its purpose changes.
Exactly. Exactly. That S shape really gained prominence in ecological thinking, back in the late 1960s and 70s as this environmental awareness was growing.
Right. Yeah. And it's not just one single type of S-shaped curve, is it? Like, I recall seeing, references to Gompertz or some other variations.
Right. You're absolutely right. There are several, related mathematical models, like you said, the Gompertz,
Yeah.
the von Bertalanffy, the Richards functions.
Right.
They all belong to this family of what we call sigmoid curves.
Okay.
And they offer slightly different ways of describing, that initial slow growth, the acceleration, and then that eventual leveling off.
Yeah.
It's really more about finding the mathematical model that best fits a particular real-world data set rather than one S-curve being, universally applicable.
Yeah.
Depends on what you're looking at.
Right. Okay, now what about situations where something seems to be growing exponentially for a while, but then just slams into a ceiling?
Right. That's where we see what's often referred to as confined exponential growth.
Okay.
Okay, so think about something like the introduction of fluoride into the U.S. water supply.
Yeah.
Or the spread of credit card usage.
Okay.
Initially, as these things are new and they're gaining traction, their adoption might look almost exponential.
Yeah.
But eventually you reach this point where most of the people who are going to adopt them, already have.
Yeah.
And further growth just becomes much slower and more constrained.
Right. It reaches that carrying capacity.
Exactly.
The potential users.
Yeah.
Okay, so the growth we see in the real world is rarely a textbook example of just one type of curve, is it?
Oh, absolutely not.
Right.
More often, it's a blend of, different growth functions kind of interacting.
Yeah.
For example, Brody's work on how livestock grow showed that you often need to use a combination of, different mathematical model to accurately capture the complex patterns of weight gain and development over an animal's lifespan.
Makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
Now, we've talked about these growth patterns that eventually hit some kind of boundary.
Right.
But what about these, these power law distributions that seem to pop up in so many seemingly unrelated fields?
Yeah.
It's quite mind-boggling.
Yeah, the inverse power laws, like Zipf's law.
Yeah.
That's, describes this really interesting relationship.
Yeah.
Where the frequency of something is inversely proportional to its rank.
Right.
And what's fascinating is you see this pattern in all sorts of places.
Yeah.
Like how often different words appear in a text.
Right.
The distribution of city sizes in a country.
Right.
Even the size of companies, the way internet traffic flows.
It's wild.
Yeah. The Pareto distribution is a related idea. And way back in the 1920s, Yule, he showed that the number of plant and beetle genera of a certain size followed this kind of power law distribution.
Interesting.
And similarly, Lotka, he found a power law in how many scientific papers different researchers publish.
It's still incredible to me how these similar mathematical relationships
I know, right?
Emerge across such different areas.
It is fascinating.
And I recall seeing something about heavy-tailed log-normal distributions as well.
Oh, yeah.
So what's the story there?
So these distributions, they have what we call heavy tails.
Yeah.
Right?
Okay.
Which essentially means that really extreme events, like very large earthquakes,
yeah,
or highly cited papers, for instance,
right,
they're more common than you'd expect if the data followed just a typical bell curve,
Right.
a normal distribution.
Normal distribution.
Yeah.
But it's important not to get carried away and assume that absolutely everything in the world follows a power law.
Right.
Just because you can fit a line to some data, right?
That is absolutely crucial.
Yeah.
While these patterns are intriguing,
Yeah.
and sometimes even quite striking,
Yeah.
just finding a mathematical fit to data doesn't automatically mean you've uncovered some fundamental law of the universe.
Right. It doesn't necessarily explain why it's happening.
Exactly, exactly.
Yeah. Okay.
As Carroll pointed out in his work on the distribution of city sizes, you can often find different mathematical models
Right.
that can explain the same pattern.
Yeah.
And some of those models might even have, completely contradictory underlying assumptions.
Right. Yeah.
So to really argue for a true power law, you need this, this really convincing explanation of the mechanism that would generate that specific kind of distribution.
Okay, so it's got to be more than just the numbers matching up.
Right, right. The allometric scaling of metabolism in living things, which we'll discuss, a bit later, is a relatively rare case where there's this strong statistical evidence and some compelling theoretical reasons behind it.
Okay.
But that's not always the case.
Yeah, that's good to keep in mind. Okay, so we've kind of gotten a handle on these different shapes that growth can take: the linear, the exponential, the S-shaped, and these power laws.
Yeah.
Now let's zoom in on, growth as it actually plays out in the natural world.
Okay.
Starting with plants.
Okay.
So when we look at plant growth, particularly in the context of crops that feed us, the contrast between traditional agriculture and modern methods is really stark, isn't it?
It really is. I mean, for thousands of years, improvements in crop yields through traditional selective breeding were incredibly slow and incremental.
Yeah.
But the development of modern breeding techniques, creating hybrid varieties and shorter, sturdier plants that could withstand the application of more fertilizer, coupled with advancements in farming practices like proper soil management, the use of fertilizers, irrigation, and pest control has led to just an absolutely massive increase in the amount of food we can grow per hectare.
Right. Yeah. It's amazing how much more efficient we've gotten.
Oh, it's incredible, and of course the future, promises even further advancements, through genetic engineering.
Yeah, I'm sure that's going to keep going.
Absolutely.
And it's a very similar story when we look at, how we've influenced the growth of animals, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, think about raising pigs.
Yeah.
Traditionally, in many parts of the world, pigs might have roamed relatively freely, foraging for food.
Right.
And could take well over 2 years to reach, a typical slaughter weight.
Okay.
Now, modern breeds, specifically bred for, meat production, raised in controlled environments, and fed these, carefully formulated high-energy diets, can reach that same weight in as little as 24 weeks.
Wow.
Like, that's incredible.
Yeah, it's amazing.
And this intense focus on, accelerating growth has even led to what you might call, commercially driven physical changes in some animals.
Yeah.
Like the remarkably enlarged breast muscles we see in modern broiler chickens.
Yeah.
Which are bred to grow so incredibly quickly.
It's interesting, this accelerated growth in animals connects to this concept of allometric scaling, doesn't it? Yeah.
Where it's about how different parts of an organism grow at different rates relative to the overall size.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. Allometric scaling describes how various, biological traits change in relation to an organism's overall body size.
Right.
So, for instance, Enquist and his colleagues discovered that the annual growth rate of trees in tropical forests, it scales with their mass to the power of roughly 34.
Interesting.
And interestingly, that same 34 exponent pops up in the metabolic rate of many animals as well.
Yeah.
And the diameter of these trees tends to scale with their mass to the power of 13.
Oh, wow.
What's truly remarkable is that Nicholas and Enquist later demonstrated that this single fundamental allometric pattern, it extends across all kinds of autotrophs, organisms that produce their own food through photosynthesis, spanning an astonishing range of sizes, from microscopic algae all the way to towering redwood trees.
Unbelievable. That's a difference of about 20 orders of magnitude in body mass.
Wow.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
It's quite humbling to, see these universal mathematical relationships kind of governing growth across such incredibly diverse forms of life.
Yeah, the patterns are pretty remarkable.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now let's zoom in even further down to the microscopic level.
Okay.
And talk about the growth of microorganisms.
Okay, sure.
So, the foundational work of Jacques Monod
Yeah. Yeah.
in the mid-20th century kind of laid out these typical phases of bacterial growth
Yeah.
when they're grown in a controlled laboratory culture.
Right.
So you usually see this, initial lag phase
Yeah.
where the bacteria are kind of adapting to their new environment
Right.
and not really actively dividing yet.
Right.
And this is followed by, an acceleration phase where they start to multiply more rapidly,
Yeah.
leading into an exponential phase where the population doubles, at this constant rate.
Right.
And then as resources become limited or waste products accumulate,
Yeah.
the growth rate slows down
It slows down.
in a retardation phase,
Mm-hmm.
eventually reaching a stationary phase where the number of new cells produced kind of equals the number of cells dying.
Right. It balances out.
And finally, if conditions become too unfavorable, you enter the death phase.
Yeah, that makes sense.
But I can imagine that growth in the real world outside of a pristine lab dish
Right.
isn't always so predictable.
Exactly.
Yeah.
In natural environments, microorganisms exist in these incredibly complex communities.
Yeah.
They're competing with each other for limited resources.
Right.
So this can lead to much, much longer and more variable lag phases.
Right.
If the necessary nutrients are scarce,
Yeah.
or if the bacteria need to develop the metabolic machinery, perhaps through mutation,
Yeah.
or acquiring genes from other microbes
Yeah.
to break down a new food source, for example.
Right.
Also, simply measuring the total number of cells
Yeah.
isn't always the best indicator of growth
Right.
in a complex environment,
Yeah.
as the average size and the metabolic activity of individual cells can change significantly during different growth phases.
It's a lot more complicated than just counting them.
Yeah, a lot more nuance.
Yeah. Okay. And, our attempts to control bacterial growth, particularly with antibiotics, have unfortunately led to some unintended and, rather serious consequences, haven't they?
Sadly, yes. The widespread and often inappropriate use of antibiotics in both human and animal medicine
Yeah.
has driven this, the evolution and spread of antibiotic-resistant bacteria, while perhaps completely preventing the emergence of resistance was always going to be a long shot.
Yeah.
We certainly haven't done enough to minimize the problem.
Right.
So now antibiotic resistance is this major, global health threat. And it's even being observed in animals that haven't been directly treated with these drugs,
Yeah.
So it highlights this interconnectedness of the issue.
It's a complex system for sure.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. Shifting gears a bit, let's talk about the growth of infections.
Okay.
The dynamics of epidemics.
Yeah.
So how do these unfold in terms of growth?
Well, studying historical epidemics can provide us with some, valuable insights into how these infectious diseases spread through populations.
Yeah.
So, for example, analysis by Moneka and his colleagues of the plague epidemic that hit Freiburg in the early 17th century found that the number of deaths over time followed a pattern,
Okay.
very close to a normal or bell-shaped distribution.
Right, that classic bell curve.
Yeah, peaking roughly around 100 days after the first deaths were recorded.
Okay, so it rises and then falls.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Kind of like,
Like a wave.
yeah, exactly, like a wave.
Yeah.
And we've seen, quite different patterns with more recent infectious disease outbreaks like influenza.
Right.
The Hong Kong flu epidemic in 2009 showed a different kind of progression.
Yeah.
And, of course, the influenza pandemic of 1918, 1919.
Right, that was a big one.
It was unique in its sheer scale and virulence.
Yeah.
While the precise origins are still debated, the winter of 1917, 1918 in China is a leading candidate.
Okay.
And the rapid spread across the globe was undoubtedly accelerated by, the mass movements of troops during World War I.
Makes sense, yeah.
By the summer of 1918, it had reached, much of the world with subsequent waves of, varying intensity hitting different regions at different times.
Yeah.
It was a complicated pandemic.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, now moving back to, larger scale natural growth, let's consider forests.
Okay.
I understand there's a key distinction between gross growth and net growth.
Right, yeah.
So what's the difference?
So gross growth refers to the total amount of new biomass produced by the trees in a forest
Okay.
over a given period.
Yeah.
Net growth, on the other hand, takes into account
Yeah.
the losses of biomass
Okay.
due to, natural mortality.
The trees dying.
Yeah, trees dying.
Yeah.
And decomposition.
Right. So some is being lost as new is growing. then.
Exactly. Exactly.
Right.
Foresters often use metrics like the current annual increment,
Okay.
often abbreviated to CAI,
Oh, CAI, yeah.
to track the growth in diameter, height, and the overall volume of wood in the trees.
Okay.
Interestingly, studies of exceptionally tall and long-lived species
Okay.
like Eucalyptus regnans in Australia
Okay.
and Sequoia sempervirens in California have revealed that even in the oldest and largest individual trees, the production of new wood in both the main trunk and the branches can continue to increase.
Right. Wow, so they never really stopped growing.
It's incredible.
Yeah.
And remarkably, some old growth forests as a whole continue to accumulate, total biomass.
That's quite counterintuitive. I mean, you'd almost expect older forests to reach some kind of steady state.
Yeah.
Where growth and decay kind of balance out.
Yeah, it seems like that's what should happen.
Yeah.
But that's not always the case.
Okay, interesting.
Yeah.
What about, the crops that often grow in and around forested areas, the crop yields that we were discussing earlier?
Yeah.
What are the, growth patterns we see there on a larger scale?
So if you look at the average yields of wheat in the United States from the late 19th century up to the present day, you can clearly see this pattern of logistic growth with a significant leveling off or plateau occurring around 1970.
Okay.
And the U.S. isn't an isolated case.
Right.
Statistical analyses have confirmed that wheat yields have reached plateaus in many other high-yielding agricultural regions around the world.
Okay.
Including, much of the European Union.
Yeah, Turkey, India, and China.
Okay.
In fact, nearly half of the regions studied have transitioned from a period of relatively linear yield growth to these more stagnant trajectories.
Okay.
And in many affluent countries, where there are already food surpluses, government agricultural policies might even indirectly discourage further increases in yield.
Okay.
To keep prices stable, basically.
So what does this widespread plateauing of crop yields imply for the future, especially when we consider the growing global population?
So to understand, the future potential for crop production, it's helpful to consider the concept of yield potential.
Okay.
This is the theoretical maximum yield that a particular crop variety could achieve under ideal conditions.
Right.
Given, its genetic makeup.
Yeah.
The available sunlight, temperature, and atmospheric CO2 levels.
And without any limitations from, nutrients, water, pests, or weeds.
Right. A perfect world.
Yeah, a perfect world.
Okay.
The yield gap is the difference between this theoretical potential yield and the actual yields that farmers are, currently achieving in their fields.
So how much better could we be doing, basically?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And this gap, particularly the portion that could realistically be closed through, better management practices, is a crucial indicator of the potential for future growth in crop yields.
Right. Okay.
And ultimately for global food security, especially in regions where, nutrition is already a precarious issue.
Yeah. Okay, now we've been talking about, the growth of individual organisms.
Right.
And populations.
Yeah.
Lift me out a bit and think about something more fundamental, the metabolism of animals.
Okay.
So is there a pattern to how an animal's energy needs kind of scale with its size?
Yes, there is.
Okay.
So this field is called the allometric scaling of metabolism.
Right, which we touched on a little bit earlier.
Yeah. And it's been observed that the metabolic rate of many animals, including carnivores and primates, generally scales with their body mass raised to a power of around 0.75.
Okay.
However, that exponent isn't universal across all of the animal kingdom.
Right, there's variation.
Yeah, there's variation.
Yeah.
For instance, insectivorous mammals tend to have a significantly lower exponent.
Okay.
And interestingly, some recent research suggests that looking at the variability in metabolic scaling within a particular species might actually be more informative
Interesting.
than trying to find, just this single universal exponent that applies to all animal life.
So it's more about the individual variation than some overall rule.
Yeah, and how that varies, throughout its life cycle as well.
Okay.
Yeah, host speaker.